The statement survives in a way that most things from that year do not. It is not a newspaper story, not a sermon, not a caution told to children. It sits in the kind of place where men kept practical records because they needed them. A ledger kept dry in a back room. A short deposition taken by a clerk who did not care about atmosphere, only about names and dates. The language is plain to the point of irritation. In the fall of 1903, a small party of hunters reported being followed in the North Woods during a multi-day hunt. They did not claim an attack. They did not claim a sighting close enough to describe in the way people describe a face. They said, with the repeated patience of men who had already been doubted, that something stayed with them in the timber. It kept itself present, just out past the distance where a shot would be clean and certain. It did not rush them. It did not call out. It did not break brush. The words they used were the words a hunter uses when he is describing a trailing animal or a man who does not want to be seen, followed, paced, kept in view, held the line. They wrote as if they were trying to make the statement useful to someone else, which is the strangest part. There is no personal grievance on the page, no attempt to elevate themselves. They do not describe courage. They do not describe panic. They describe interruption. They were asked, later, why they did not fire. One of them answered in a way that suggests the question had offended him. He said they did not shoot because they did not know what they would be shooting at, and because it remained in a position where the eye could not make a proper decision. There was never a clean moment. Always trees, always distance, always the sense that the thing was not moving in the way an animal moves. What keeps the account from slipping into the category of folklore is how little it gives you. There is no moral. There is no origin. There is no reason offered for why it would follow them. They do not name a curse or a burial ground or a broken rule. They do not say they were punished. They only say they were observed and constrained. They mark their route. They note the weather. They note the hours when the woods went wrong. The claim enters the record without context because, to them, context was not the point. The point was that there was a presence that changed how a hunt could be conducted. The point was that it altered the ordinary signals the forest gives a man who is paying attention. The statement reads like an attempt to warn another crew in the simplest terms possible. Something kept pace with us. Something remained near. Something made the woods behave incorrectly. There is a detail I have always returned to, because it is the closest the deposition comes to emotion. One of the hunters said that the worst part was not seeing it. The worst part was how quickly they began to plan their movements around it, without meaning to. He said they found themselves choosing timber lines they would not normally choose, setting camp earlier than they needed, staying closer together in a way that felt childish. He wrote that it was as if the forest had developed a new rule, and they had learned it by pressure rather than instruction. The surviving copy ends the way a work document ends. A signature, a date, a brief note about where the statement was taken. No flourish, no appeal. If you read only that page, you are left with a narrow, unsettling idea. In 1903, men who made their living by being alone in wild country said they were followed, and they said it plainly enough that someone bothered to keep the paper. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what those men were and what a hunt was to them. Not as entertainment, not as a story to tell later, but as methodical work performed in silence. You have to understand how reliable their senses had to be for them to eat and earn and come home. And you have to understand what it takes for an unfamiliar fear to stand out against everything else the woods can do to you. In that part of the country at the turn of the century, hunting was not a weekend novelty. It was meat, it was hides, it was trade. It was a skill taught early and corrected harshly. Men who hunted for profit or necessity did not romanticize their time out. They did not go into the woods to feel brave. They went in to complete a task and return with the result. A multi-day hunt was governed by routine because routine kept you alive. You rose before light, not because it felt righteous, but because movement in the woods is different when the sun is low. Tracks show in dew. Disturbed leaves are easier to read. Sound carries in a predictable way. You ate quickly, kept your gear minimal, and checked the small things that prevent disasters. The strap that will snap, the powder that has drawn moisture, the knife that has dulled enough to slip. They moved in spacing that was agreed upon without much talk. Too close, and you spooked game. Too far, and you lost the safety of another set of eyes. A good party could hold a line through rough timber with little communication. One man watches the ground, one watches the mid-distance, one watches the high points, and all of them listen. They listen for the specific irregularities that mean a deer has paused, or that a bear has turned, or that another man has stepped where he should not be stepping. Silence was not just preference, it was method. The woods were full of small sounds that mattered. The dry click of a twig that has no wind behind it. The shush of brush moving against fur. The quick beat of wings when a bird lifts suddenly. A disciplined hunter learns what belongs. He learns the normal envelope of noise and activity. He learns what it means when squirrels cut out, or when crows begin to pace you from ridge to ridge. He learns to measure distance by sound, and to know when sound is behaving wrong. There were dangers they accepted as part of the work. Weather could change faster than a man could walk back out. A twisted ankle in the wrong place could become a slow death. A rifle accident, a fall, a cut that will not close. Predators were not the chief worry, but they were not imaginary either. A wounded animal can turn and kill you. A bear can take offense. A moose, cornered or surprised, can ruin a man in seconds. These were known threats. They had shape and behavior. They left sign. Even when they were frightening, they made sense inside the rules of the forest. That is what makes the 1903 account difficult to dismiss. These were men trained to interpret signs with their lives depending on accuracy. They knew what it meant to be stalked by an animal, and they knew what it meant to be watched by another human. A poacher will track you. A rival crew might shadow your line. Sometimes you are followed because someone wants what you are carrying, or because they want you gone. So when they used the language of pursuit, it was not theatrical language. It was technical language. Followed, paced, present. In the ordinary course of a hunt, there are 100 moments of uncertainty. A shadow that turns out to be a stump. A movement that turns out to be wind. A sound that turns out to be your own pack strap. Hunters live with those mistakes and correct them. They do not build stories out of them. They are embarrassed by them. A fear that persists after correction is rare. A fear that persists across multiple men in the same party is rarer. And a fear that changes behavior, not in a dramatic burst, but in a slow tightening of rules, is something else again. It suggests not a momentary misread, but a continuing pressure that does not resolve itself as the day progresses. In 1903, those hunters did not come out talking about a monster. They came out talking about method being interrupted, about the forest failing to behave in its usual ways, about familiar signs going absent, and about the sensation of being kept in view as if by design. When you speak with older hunters or read their journals, you learn there is a particular kind of unease they describe when the woods stop providing feedback. Not when something loud happens, but when the small confirmations are removed. The bird calls that normally mark the time of day, the distant chatter of squirrels. The background rustle that tells you the wind is moving as expected. Those things are like the pulse of the place. They reassure you without your noticing. The 1903 account begins to turn when that pulse begins to fail, not once, but repeatedly, and at times when it should have been steady. The men did not write that they were frightened at first. They wrote that the woods became quiet at the wrong times, and that the quiet did not feel like weather. That is where the record shifts from an odd claim into something you can almost place your hands on. Because hunters know quiet. They know the quiet that comes before a storm. They know the quiet that comes when game has been spooked. They know the quiet that comes when they themselves have been careless. And they know in their bones when quiet has no proper cause. The first deviations were small. That is how these things begin. A patch of timber that seems muffled. A stretch of trail that feels newly wrong. A sense, not of being attacked, but of being kept in view. As if the forest itself has decided the party should not be allowed to move unobserved. They did not call it supernatural, they called it incorrect. And in a disciplined trade, incorrectness is the first real warning. They were used to silence in the sense that they could move for an hour without speaking. That kind of silence was chosen. It was a tool. What they noticed, according to the surviving notes, was a silence that arrived without invitation and stayed longer than it should. It happened first in the early afternoon of the second day, when they were moving along a drainage where birds usually kept up a constant argument. The party had been steady, not rushing, not lingering. The wind was light. There was no heavy weather coming in. And then, in the space of a minute, the background sound thinned out until it felt as if cotton had been stuffed into the air. Not a sudden hush like a gunshot spooking everything. No frantic scatter, just an absence. The little confirmations went missing. No chatter in the trees. No distant wing beats. Even the faint movement of leaves seemed reduced. One of the men later wrote that the quiet felt directional, as though the sound had not been removed everywhere, only around them. At first they checked themselves. Hunters do. They slowed down, watched their footing, adjusted their line. If you are too loud, the woods will go quiet. If you are moving wrong, you will feel it reflected back at you. They corrected for that, and the quiet stayed. Then sound began to behave oddly. A snapped twig behind them sounded too close, as if the distance had collapsed. A soft cough sounded too loud, carrying farther than it should. Later, when one of the dogs shifted in the brush, the noise did not travel at all. It was as if the timber could decide, moment by moment, what to amplify and what to swallow. They noticed trails that looked altered in ways that did not fit the weather. A shallow track in damp soil that should have held its shape looked smeared, not by rain, but by something dragged lightly across it. A strip of moss that had been intact the year prior was torn, as if by repeated brushing, but there was no fresh windfall, no storm sign to explain it. These were small details. In another context they might have been dismissed. But they were the kind of details that, when combined, make a hunter stop trusting his map of the place. What they describe next is the earliest form of the pressure that would later become their main claim. They felt kept in view. That phrase appears more than once in the account, and it is a strange phrase to put on paper. It suggests an awareness of another line of sight in the woods, a sense that their movement was not simply observed but managed, as though a distance was being maintained on purpose. They did not say they were being approached. They said they were being paced. In practical terms, that meant they began to look back more than was useful. They began to pause for reasons they could not name. They began to linger at the edges of small clearings instead of crossing through the center. Their eyes spent more time searching mid-distance than reading the ground. A hunter is trained to put his attention where it pays. Tracks first, then sign, then movement. When attention shifts without reason, it costs you. It makes the day inefficient. It makes you tired earlier. It makes you make mistakes. So when the 1903 party found their attention repeatedly pulled up and outward, they noticed that too. It was like trying to work while someone stood just out of sight in the doorway. At one point, according to the clerked version, one man turned sharply because he felt the sensation of being watched from his left. He saw nothing but trees, and yet the sensation did not fade. It held steady, as if he had turned toward the wrong angle. He turned again, slower, and the sensation moved with him, remaining just beyond the point where he could anchor it to a shape. This is the part of the narrative where a modern listener might expect the account to jump into description. It does not. It stays stubbornly procedural. They did not say they saw a figure then. They said the woods had begun to feel like it was arranging their attention. As the afternoon carried on, the quiet came and went in waves. It returned at times when it should not have, such as in the hour before dusk when the forest usually grows louder with small movement. Instead, they moved through a kind of hollow stillness that made their own breathing feel intrusive. It forced them to hear themselves, and in that self-awareness, their discipline began to tighten. The men did not argue about it, at least not on record. What began to happen instead was a gradual synchronization. They began to slow at the same moments. They began to stop at the same moments. They began to look at each other more often, not for conversation, but for confirmation. The absence in the forest was doing something that threats rarely do. It was drawing agreement out of them without needing words. That agreement, unspoken and practical, is what makes the next stage of the account feel credible. Because it is one thing for a man to report a sensation alone. It is another for several men to begin making the same adjustments independently, as if a new condition has entered the work and must be accommodated. By the time they made their second camp, the party was behaving differently. They were not yet panicked. They were not yet certain. But they were already beginning to share a decision without admitting it out loud. And that is where their story deepens. Not in what they said to each other, but in what they did without conversation. On the third morning, their routine looked the same from a distance. They rose, checked gear, handled food, moved out. But the small changes were visible even in the dry language of a hunting note. Their spacing tightened. Their pauses lasted longer. Their eyes were no longer relaxed. They were working under a condition they did not want to name. Hunters talk less as they get better, but they still communicate. A hand signal, a shift in the line, a low murmur when something needs to be decided. What is notable in the 1903 account is how often decisions were made without any of those signals being recorded. They simply began to do the same thing at the same time. One of the men wrote that he realized, halfway through the morning, that no one had taken the lead position the way they normally did. They were moving more like a cluster than a line, not because they were lost, but because they seemed unwilling to allow open space between them. No one said, "Stay close." They stayed close anyway. They would slow and stop in places where there was no obvious sign to justify it. When they did stop, they did not talk. They listened. They scanned. And then they moved again as if a silent timer had completed its cycle. Eye contact began to replace speech. A raised eyebrow. A brief look toward a particular stand of trees. A nod that meant you felt it too. It is difficult to describe that kind of group behavior if you have not lived it. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is the quiet efficiency of men adapting to a variable they do not understand, and it is made more unsettling by how natural it becomes. They were not making a plan. They were responding to pressure. The dog should have been the stabilizing factor. Dogs do not care about stories. They care about scent and sound. A well-trained hunting dog can cut through a man's nerves by behaving normally. In this account, the dogs did not behave normally. At first, they were simply inconsistent. One would track eagerly for a few minutes, then stop and circle back as if the scent had gone thin. Another would refuse a path that should have been easy. At a creek crossing where they expected the dogs to jump and splash, they hesitated on the bank, whining softly, then backed away and walked along the edge as if unwilling to commit to the water. They did not bolt, not at first. They did not bark at a visible threat. Their behavior was closer to confusion or refusal, as if they were being asked to enter a space that did not match their understanding of the world. One of the hunters later said the dogs behaved as if the woods had become a room with a person in it, a person the dogs did not want to look at. There is a moment recorded in the clerk's hand where the party came to a fork in a familiar game trail. The hunters expected the lead dog to take the left branch toward a ridge line where deer often moved. Instead, the dog stopped, lowered its head, then backed away with its tail down. The second dog approached, sniffed, and did the same. They refused the left branch entirely. That kind of refusal is not typical. Dogs refuse when they smell a predator close, or when they sense danger they cannot interpret. But in those cases you usually see agitation, barking, hackles raised. Here the refusal was quiet, almost resigned. The men did not argue about what it meant. They did not debate whether to force the dogs. They simply took the right branch, not because it made tactical sense, but because none of them wanted to be the one who insisted on the path the dogs would not take. That is how agreement forms without speech. Not through discussion, but through avoidance. As the day progressed, the group's attention began to converge on the same empty spaces. A gap between pines. A dark line where a stand of fir thickened. A slope where the undergrowth was sparse enough to see farther than usual. More than once, all of them found themselves watching a place where nothing moved, as if expecting a movement that never came. When you read their later words, you can feel how they were trying to remain professional. They continued to track. They continued to look for sign. They continued to perform the work. But each of those actions now had a second purpose. They were not only hunting game. They were monitoring their own environment for a presence they could not fully confirm. There is a tension in that kind of split attention. It makes the woods feel tighter. It makes distances feel shorter. It makes every pause feel loaded. And because none of them wanted to admit fear, the fear took the form of discipline. They became stricter with themselves. They became quieter. They watched more carefully. They stopped more often. At no point in this section of the account do they say, "We were terrified." Instead, you can see the fear in their coordination. You can see it in the way they no longer allowed one man to drift ahead to check a ridge. You can see it in the way they began to set their camp earlier, even before the event that would later become the center of their claim. In a typical hunt, you do not stop early unless weather forces you or injury requires it. Stopping early costs you daylight, and daylight is money. These men began to stop early because movement after dusk would mean moving through timber without the small confirming noises that usually accompany evening. Something had shifted their sense of control. They were not being chased, not in any ordinary way. They were being managed. And once a group begins to behave as if it is being managed, they begin to reach for knowledge that is older than record-keeping. The kind of advice passed from one hunter to another without ever being written down. That is the next thing that enters the story. Not a legend told for entertainment, but a small piece of old advice presented as professionalism. The kind of thing you do not repeat, unless you think it might matter. Later, when the statement was taken, one of the hunters was asked if he had ever heard of anything like what they described. He hesitated, and that hesitation is marked in the way the clerk wrote the line, as if the pause itself was notable. Then he said there had been talk in past seasons about a tall figure seen at distance in certain parts of the timber. He said it in the same tone you might use to mention a place where the footing is unreliable, or a creek that floods unexpectedly. He did not present it as a campfire story. He presented it as old advice. There are things hunters tell each other that never make it into official records because they cannot be proven and because they are not useful unless you are already in the situation. Don't take that ridge after dusk. Don't cut across that bog alone. If you hear knocking without wind, leave. Statements like that survive because they are attached to outcomes. Someone got hurt. Someone got lost. Someone came back different. In 1903, one of the older men in the party had apparently mentioned, before the trip, that certain areas had a reputation for strange sightings at the edge of vision. Not a creature, not an animal sign, but a figure in the trees. He did not give details. He did not want to. The advice, as recalled later, was simple. Don't linger. Don't separate. Keep moving. If you notice it, do not stop to confirm it. What is striking is that the advice is framed as efficiency, not as fear, not as superstition, as if stopping to look would cost you in a way that mattered, even if nothing happened, as if the act of acknowledging the presence was itself a mistake. The name used, according to the account, was spoken sparingly. A label, not a description. The men did not dwell on it. They did not write out a myth. They did not say where it came from. They did not say it was true. They simply admitted that the idea existed in the background of their trade, like a rumor you hear, and choose not to repeat, because repeating it gives it weight. The older man had reportedly said, years prior, that he had once seen something tall standing among the trees at a distance where it could not be measured properly. He said it did not move the way a man moves. He said there was no sound. He said that when he tried to get a better angle, it seemed to be in a different place without having crossed the distance between. He did not call it a ghost. He did not call it a demon. He did not attach it to religion. He treated it like an unprofitable condition, something you avoid because engaging with it does not improve your odds. In the 1903 party, this old advice resurfaced not as a story told aloud in full, but as a kind of shared memory they were reluctant to admit. When the woods went quiet in the wrong way, when the dogs refused a path, when their own attention began to pull toward empty mid-distance, someone likely remembered that old warning without wanting to bring it into the open. If you have ever been in a group of working men under stress, you understand how certain topics hover without being spoken. You can feel the conversation that does not happen, the thing everyone is thinking but no one wants to put into words, because once it is said, it becomes real enough to shape decisions openly. That is what seems to occur here. The advice, don't linger, don't separate, begins to express itself in behavior even before anyone formally acknowledges why. They begin to hold their line tighter. They begin to avoid open clearings where line of sight extends too far. They begin to choose routes that keep them in broken timber rather than crossing open ground, even when open ground would be easier. And then, according to the account, there comes the first restrained confirmation. Not an explanation, not a confrontation. Simply a moment when someone sees something that matches the old advice closely enough that doubt changes shape. The record does not treat this moment as a climax. It treats it as a condition becoming visible. The hunter who first saw it did not call out. He did not announce it, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because hunters do not call out unless they are certain. Calling out would have forced the group to look, to confirm, to stop. And the old advice, the never-written advice, said do not stop. So he did what a professional does when faced with a variable he cannot name. He observed, he noted. He adjusted his movement. He kept his breathing steady. And he waited to see whether the thing would close distance like an animal, or whether it would behave in a way that did not belong to the woods at all. That moment, quiet and contained, is where the claim begins to solidify. Because what follows is not a single sighting that can be dismissed as a trick of light. What follows is a pattern of pursuit without approach, a shape that holds itself between trees with no sound. The first clear indication of being followed is described not as drama, but as pacing. And once pacing is observed, the men's doubt begins to drain away, replaced by a kind of grim attention that does not need words. It was late morning when the first man saw the movement that did not fit. He was not scanning the treetops or staring into shadows the way frightened people do. He was doing what he had always done, reading ground sign while keeping half his attention on the middle distance. The party was moving along a slope where the timber thinned enough to see between trunks, not a clear view, but a layered view of gray and brown and filtered light. At first it registered as a vertical interruption, not an animal shape, not a branch. A straightness that seemed wrong against the natural angles of the forest. He saw it between two trees, far enough away that the mind could still argue with itself about what it was seeing. He did not stop. Stopping would have turned the moment into a decision. Instead he slowed slightly, as if checking something on the ground. He used that small change in speed to keep the interruption in the same part of his peripheral vision. As the party continued forward, the interruption shifted in a way that suggested it was shifting too. Not moving toward them, not moving away, but keeping itself aligned with their forward progress, matching pace. Remaining in that uncertain distance where you can see something but cannot make a clean choice about it. A deer that is pacing you does not do this. A deer flees. A bear either avoids you or approaches with purpose. Even a human following you leaves sound. Footfalls brush a snapped twig. This movement produced none of that. It was as if the forest simply contained, at a constant distance, a feature that was not part of it. The man later wrote that what convinced him it was pursuit was not the shape itself, but the timing. Each time the party slowed, the presence seemed to hold. Each time they moved, it moved. When they angled slightly left, the shape appeared again through a new gap in the trees, not in the same place, but in the place it needed to be to remain parallel. He still did not speak. Hunters do not name what they cannot confirm, because naming forces action. He waited for someone else to notice, and in that waiting you can feel the pressure building. He became aware of his own breathing. He became aware of how loud his clothing sounded. He became aware of how even the smallest human noise felt inappropriate in the quiet that surrounded them. After perhaps 10 minutes of this, one of the other men slowed too. Not because he was tired, because he had seen the same interruption. The two men did not speak. They made brief eye contact, then looked away, then looked back into the timber as if by doing so they could keep the presence from becoming fully real. The party began to adjust without instruction. Their spacing tightened further. They shifted slightly downslope where the timber was denser, reducing the long sight lines that made the presence easier to notice. This was not a tactical adjustment for hunting game. It was an adjustment for living with a watcher. At one point the presence vanished, not by moving away, but by failing to appear in the gaps where it had been appearing. The man who had first noticed it felt a brief surge of relief, then a colder thought. If it could choose when to be visible, then visibility meant something. The dogs, which had been uneasy all morning, became more difficult to manage. They pulled back toward the hunters instead of ranging ahead. One of them sat down abruptly and refused to move until it was tugged, and even then it moved with reluctance, looking back repeatedly into the trees. The hunters continued. They did not run. They did not shout. They did not fire. The woods, in its wrong quiet, did not give them a clear target. And there is another element here that is easy to overlook. These men were not eager to create a confrontation that might not be necessary. A gunshot in deep timber is not a simple thing. It carries. It announces you. It invites whatever is in the woods to locate you more accurately. A professional avoids that unless there is a reason. Then the presence appeared again, and this time the man who saw it had a clearer angle. It was still between trees, still at that uncertain distance, but the alignment of trunks and light allowed him to register something about its proportions. It was not low to the ground. It was not broad like an animal. It was tall, too tall for the way the mind expects height to appear in a forest. It seemed to occupy a narrow vertical space, and it seemed to remain still even as it changed position between sightings. Stillness is not rare in the woods. Animals freeze. People hide. But the stillness here was not the stillness of caution. It was the stillness of something that did not need to worry about being detected. It was present, and it did not care if it was seen. The hunter wrote later that he felt an impulse to call the others' attention to it, to make it shared and therefore less personal. He resisted that impulse. He said, in plain words, that he did not want to be the one to stop the group. He did not want to be the one to turn them toward it. He did not want to be the one to invite it closer through recognition. Instead, he watched for evidence that it was closing distance. It did not. It maintained that same frustrating line, far enough to remain ambiguous, near enough to be constant. By the time the third man noticed, the presence had already established itself as a condition of the hunt. They were not deciding whether something was there. They were deciding how to move with it there. That is how the account remains restrained. There is no moment where a monster steps into the open. There is only the steady realization, confirmed by multiple eyes, that something was moving with them without sound and without the normal logic of pursuit. The hunters did not say, "It wanted us." They did not say, "It hated us." They did not say, "It was going to kill us." They said it followed. They said it paced. They said it remained present. And once you have a presence that remains present, doubt becomes a luxury. You stop debating what it might be and start noticing how it behaves. That is what happens next. The shape begins to show itself often enough and from angles inconsistent enough that the men are forced to admit it is not an animal and not a man. Not because of a single clear view, but because of the way it refuses to behave like anything the forest normally contains. Over the next several hours the party saw it in fragments. Never a full, clean view. Always partial, always framed by trunks, always at a distance that made the eye strain. But fragments can be enough when they repeat. The first thing they registered consistently was height. Not merely tall, but tall in a way that did not match the spacing of the woods. A man standing among trees still reads as a man because of proportion and posture. Even at a distance you see the suggestion of shoulders, the way weight sits over hips, the way the head turns. This presence did not offer those cues. It appeared as a vertical length, narrow enough that it could have been mistaken for a tree at the edge of vision, except that it was in the wrong place to be a tree, and it was capable of not being there a minute later. It did not sway like a trunk. It did not lean into wind. It held itself straight with a kind of unnatural patience. The second thing was stillness. Animals freeze, but when they freeze you can feel tension in them. You can sense the potential for movement. A deer holds itself ready to bolt. A bear holds itself ready to lunge or retreat. The stillness described here was not ready stillness. It was a neutral stillness, like an object placed upright. Except it was not an object, because it changed location without the in-between. At one point the party turned to skirt around a thicket. A normal follower would either cut through or fall behind and then reappear. The presence, according to two of the men, appeared again on the far side of the thicket, maintaining parallel position as though the dense brush had not been an obstacle. They did not hear it push through. They did not hear it go around. It was simply there again, upright between trunks, waiting. This is where the account becomes explicit in the only way it allows itself. One hunter stated that it did not behave like an animal. He did not say it behaved like a spirit. He said it did not behave like wildlife. That is a professional judgment, not a metaphysical one. A man following you will also behave in certain ways. He will use cover, yes, but he will need to place his feet. He will make errors. He will occasionally show too much movement, a glimpse of a sleeve, a flash of skin, a shape that implies clothing. The presence in the 1903 account offered none of those. It offered only a consistent impression of vertical form. They began to see it at different angles, which should not have been possible if it were one stationary object, and they were simply passing it. It appeared behind them at times when their forward movement should have placed it out of line. It appeared on higher ground when they had been moving lower. It appeared nearer, then farther, without any corresponding sound or effort. What they were being forced to accept was not merely that something was there, but that it had control over position, that it could remain aligned with them regardless of the terrain between. The woods itself began to feel less like a space they were moving through and more like a field in which something else was arranging the terms. That feeling is hard to articulate without exaggeration, and the men do not try. They show it through their choices. They stopped pursuing game sign. They began to prioritize routes that kept cover between them and the presence. They began to avoid any movement that would put them in silhouette against open ground. And still it remained. There is a line in the surviving notes that reads almost like annoyance. One of the men said it did not come closer. He said it was as if it did not need to. That line carries more fear than any dramatic description could. Because if the thing did not need to approach to achieve its effect, then what was its effect? As the day wore on, the party's confidence in their senses began to erode in a specific way. They still trusted tracks. They still trusted wind. They still trusted the feel of terrain underfoot. What they stopped trusting was their ability to be alone. That is an enormous change for a hunter. Solitude is not merely a condition, it is an assumption. You are alone unless proven otherwise. Here they were being proven otherwise repeatedly, without the normal mechanics of proof. They began to avoid looking directly toward it for too long. Not because it was painful, not because it did anything overt, but because sustained attention made them feel as if they were giving something away. One of them later said that when he stared into the trees trying to confirm it, he felt foolish, like a man trying to stare down a shadow. And yet he could not stop checking. That is the psychological signature of being followed without being approached. You cannot resolve it through confrontation because it denies you the terms of confrontation. It stays close enough to shape your behavior, far enough to remain beyond action. By late afternoon, the men no longer needed the old advice to guide them. They were creating their own discipline in response to a thing that would not declare itself fully. They were being trained in real time by proximity. The shape did not rush them. It did not lunge. It did not vocalize. It did not step into open ground. It allowed them to continue the day, but it continued with them. And that continuation, that repetition, is what makes the next section so heavy. Because the fear is no longer in the question of what it is. The fear is in the routine of it, in the way it becomes part of the day, like weather, except weather does not watch you back. They were followed. They were not attacked. And in that distinction, their unease deepened into something more durable. Not panic, but a sustained pressure that altered every decision they made. That night they set camp earlier than they had planned, and not in a place they would have chosen under normal circumstances. They picked denser timber, closer to natural cover, away from open lines where moonlight might expose them. They did not say why in the record. They did not need to. The earlier pattern had already established the reason. In a normal hunt, camp is practical. You want water. You want a place where wind is manageable. You want a clear enough area to work without tripping over roots in the dark. Here, the practical priorities shifted. They were no longer optimizing comfort. They were optimizing concealment, even though concealment from an unknown observer is a strange concept for men carrying rifles in the woods. The presence did not appear openly near the camp. There is no description of it standing at the edge of firelight, no dramatic outline against the trees. Instead, the men recorded the sense that it remained in the area, held at the same kind of distance as before. They heard nothing, no footfalls, no brush breaking. The dogs were restless, pacing and then lying down, then rising again, as if they could not settle. One dog refused to face away from the deeper woods, always repositioning itself so its body was oriented toward the trees. The men slept poorly, not because of a noise that woke them, but because of the expectation of waking. They woke to check the fire, to listen, to stare into darkness that offered no confirmation one way or the other. That kind of night is exhausting. It does not give you the relief of a clear threat. It gives you only vigilance. The next morning they resumed the hunt with reduced ambition. They moved, but they moved as if their main goal had shifted from taking game to maintaining control over their own position. They chose routes that kept them close to each other. They avoided open spaces. They kept the dogs close. The sightings increased in frequency, not by becoming dramatic, but by becoming unavoidable. The presence appeared in more gaps, in more angles, in more moments, when it should not have been able to relocate as quickly as it seemed to. The men began to anticipate it, which is a terrible kind of adaptation. They began to look into a patch of trees and think, it will be there, and sometimes it was. And yet it did not close the distance. That is the defining pressure. If it had approached, they could have fired. They could have shouted. They could have made a decisive move. Instead, it maintained a line that kept them in an ongoing state of reaction. They could not ignore it because it was too consistent. They could not resolve it because it refused to offer a resolvable moment. The hunters began changing routes instinctively, not always for reasons they could articulate. They would angle left without discussing it. They would stop short of a clearing and choose a longer path around. They would avoid certain stands of trees where the quiet felt thicker. Their work became less efficient, and they knew it. The record indicates frustration at wasted hours, at the way their tracking was interrupted, but the frustration sits alongside something else. A recognition that the woods had become a place where lingering created risk, even if that risk could not be named. At one point, according to one man's later recollection, they came upon fresh sign of deer moving through a shallow valley. Under normal circumstances, they would have taken the trail and followed it patiently. Instead, they paused, looked at each other, and turned away, not because the sign was poor, because following it would have pulled them deeper into a corridor where sightlines narrowed and retreat would be complicated. That choice reveals the state they were in. They were no longer hunting. They were being moved. The presence remained silent. It did not vocalize. It did not make threat displays. It did not do what predators do to test and intimidate. It did not do what men do to reveal intention. It simply maintained its distance and position, like a surveyor keeping a line. Over time, the hunters stopped trying to confirm it in any detailed way. They accepted it as a condition and focused on managing their proximity to it. This is a subtle shift, but an important one. It marks the point where the phenomenon stops being an anomaly and starts being a rule. They began to develop habits that were not consciously agreed upon, but were enforced through discomfort. If one man drifted a few steps too far, the others tightened in. If a dog ranged ahead, it was called back immediately. When dusk approached, they grew more rigid, less willing to take risks, less willing to talk at all. Fear, in professional men, often appears as an increase in procedure. The less control you feel, the more you cling to routine. But here routine itself had been compromised, so they created new routine, new rules, shaped by the presence's behavior. By the end of that day, they were no longer reacting moment to moment. They were living under a set of constraints that had formed around them, and the constraints were not written down, not commanded, not debated. They were simply obeyed. That is how the next phase begins. Not with a confrontation, but with unspoken rules becoming explicit through repetition. A discipline that hardens, not because someone orders it, but because violating it feels immediately wrong. The men did not yet abandon the hunt. They still believed, perhaps, that the condition might fade, that they might move out of the affected area, that it might be tied to a particular stretch of forest. But their behavior suggests they were already preparing for the possibility that it would not fade, and that they would have to withdraw. Before withdrawal becomes inevitable, you see the rules form. No separation, camp early, silence at dusk, avoid open clearings. Not because those rules guarantee safety, but because breaking them feels like inviting attention. And attention in this story is the one thing the men cannot afford to increase. The rules were never announced. No one stood over the others and said, "From now on we do this." The rules emerge the way a man learns to keep his hand away from a hot stove, through immediate discomfort, through a sense that deviation produced risk. The first rule was simple: no separation under any condition. In earlier days of hunting, one man might peel off to check a ridge or circle around a thicket. Here they did not do that, not even for a minute. If someone needed to step away to deal with gear or relieve himself, the others waited, close enough that no one stood alone among the trees. That kind of closeness is unnatural for experienced hunters. It makes you feel crowded. It makes movement inefficient. It can even be dangerous if rifles are carried carelessly. But they accepted the inefficiency because the alternative felt worse. The second rule followed. Camps were set earlier than planned. They stopped while there was still light, while they could still see enough to choose terrain and build a fire without fumbling. They chose sites that were not ideal for hunting, but were easier to defend psychologically. Places with back cover. Places where the timber was thick enough that long sight lines did not pull the eye into darkness. They kept the fire smaller than usual. Fire is comfort, but it is also exposure. A bright fire makes you visible in a wide radius. These men treated light like a liability. The third rule was silence at dusk. Not silence in the normal hunting sense, but a deliberate refusal to create unnecessary sound during the hour when the forest becomes ambiguous. They minimized talking. They minimized movement. They listened more than they needed to for practical reasons, as if sound might carry a warning. The fourth rule was avoidance of open clearings. Open spaces are not inherently dangerous. In fact, they can be safer in some circumstances because you can see. But open spaces also place you in the center of a visible field, and in this account visibility itself had become uncomfortable. The men avoided being framed against sky or snow or open ground. They preferred broken timber, even though broken timber is where you can be approached unseen. These rules reveal something about what they believed, consciously or not. They believed that being seen mattered, even if they did not understand why. They believed that lingering in view was a mistake. The old advice echoes here without being quoted. They also began to change how they looked. They used their eyes differently. They stopped staring into the trees. They stopped scanning for confirmation the way a frightened person does. Instead, they checked quickly, as if prolonged looking might be noticed in return. The dogs, under these rules, were kept close and treated less like tools and more like indicators. Their reactions became part of the decision-making process. If a dog stiffened, the men slowed. If a dog refused a path, they did not force it. They accepted refusal as data. On the morning of the fourth day, they woke with the particular fatigue that comes from vigilance. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were sharper than they wanted to be. They ate quickly, packed, and moved out not with the patience of hunters enjoying their work, but with the urgency of men trying to finish something before a condition worsens. The presence was still there, or if not visible, it was assumed. That assumption had become part of the rules too. They no longer treated its absence as relief. They treated absence as uncertainty. As they moved, the men began to avoid certain natural funnels in the terrain, places where the land narrows and movement becomes predictable. A ravine, a creek bed with steep banks, a stretch of timber hemmed by rock. Under normal circumstances, these features are useful because game moves through them. Here they were avoided because they felt like places where the presence could position itself more effectively. This is where the account's tension deepens toward inevitability. The men had adapted as far as adaptation could take them. They were now moving through the woods under a set of constraints that were not sustainable. Every hour under pressure reduces judgment. Every night under vigilance reduces discipline. Eventually something gives. The 1903 party did not wait for a dramatic event to force them out. What forced them out, according to their own words, was a moment when distance collapsed, not into an attack, but into proximity. They reached a point where the forest felt too close. Not because trees physically moved, but because the presence appeared nearer than it had before, enough that the men could no longer pretend the distance was stable. Enough that the rules they had formed were no longer sufficient. That moment is described with the same restraint as the rest, but you can feel the shift in it. The men stopped describing procedure and began describing sensation. Not panic, but inevitability. The next section contains the peak tension of the account, not because something leaps out, but because the condition becomes undeniable in a way that eliminates all remaining options except retreat. The day had been cold enough that breath showed, and cold can sharpen sound. It can make a forest feel brittle. They moved through timber that should have been familiar, not because every tree was known, but because the structure of the land was known. Ridges, drainages, thickets, clearings. The men were not lost in geography. They were lost in a new way of occupying the space. The presence had been maintaining its distance for days, holding itself at the edge of certainty. That distance became part of how they managed themselves. It became a boundary line they expected to hold. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, that boundary failed. One of the men noticed it first because his body reacted before his mind did. He wrote later that his stomach tightened the way it tightens when you realize an animal is closer than you thought. He looked up not because he wanted to, but because the sensation demanded confirmation. Across a shallow slope between a stand of thin trunks, the vertical shape was there again, but it was closer, not close enough to touch. Not close enough to see details the way you see details on a human, but close enough that the proportion became harder to deny. The height was clearer now. It stood above the usual visual line where a man's head would appear at that distance. And yet it did not seem to occupy space the way a tall man would. It remained narrow, its outline resistant to the normal cues that allow you to interpret a body. There was no sound. That detail repeats in their account as if they wanted the listener to understand that silence was not incidental. Silence was part of the phenomenon, a thing that close, moving through timber, should have produced some indication of effort. A footfall, a branch displaced, a subtle shift in brush. There was none. The men did not speak. Their rules held even here. They tightened together, rifles held in a ready way without being raised to aim. Aiming would have been an admission of target. They did not yet have that. They began to move, slowly, angling away. And this is the moment where their language shifts. They do not describe being chased. They describe being positioned. The presence did not rush after them. It did not close distance aggressively. Instead, when they changed direction, it appeared again in a place that suggested it had anticipated that change. Not by cutting through in a way a man could, not by running, simply by being where it needed to be to remain parallel. It was as if the forest had a second set of paths that did not require physical travel. That idea is never stated in the record. It is only implied through the description of reappearance. The men could not explain how it relocated. They only knew that it did. And they knew that its relocation was not random. It maintained the same relationship to their movement. It stayed present in a way that made retreat feel complicated. This is where the sensation of closeness deepened. Not in feet and yards, but in options. The forest began to feel as if it offered fewer routes. The men began to feel as if their choices were being narrowed. One of them wrote later that he realized they were no longer choosing where to go. They were choosing where not to go. That is a subtle but devastating shift. When you are choosing where not to go, you are already under control. The dogs became almost unmanageable. They did not bark. They did not charge. They pressed close to the men's legs, whining low, pulling back against the direction of travel, as if attempting to reverse the entire party. One dog urinated on itself, a detail the record includes without commentary. It is the kind of detail a man includes when he is trying to be honest, even if it makes the scene seem undignified. The presence appeared again, and this time more than one man saw it clearly enough to agree on form. They later described long limbs. Not in a grotesque way, not with flourish, but as a practical observation. The shape seemed to have length in its arms and legs beyond what a human should have. The limbs did not swing. They did not indicate walking. They simply existed as part of a vertical figure that did not seem to require motion cues to change position. Their recognition, the cold recognition that it was neither man nor animal, came not with screams but with a kind of tightening silence. They became more efficient, less talkative, more focused on withdrawal. At this point they abandoned the hunt in everything but name. They stopped tracking. They stopped scanning for game. Their entire attention went to movement and spacing, to keeping the party intact, to avoiding open ground, and to moving toward the direction that would take them out of the affected area. They did not run. Running in the woods is dangerous, and it also signals panic. They moved fast in the way trained men move fast, with controlled urgency. They minimized unnecessary noise. They kept rifles ready but unfired. The presence maintained its behavior. That is what makes this moment the peak. The thing did not have to change its nature to increase pressure. It only had to reduce distance once, and the entire structure of the men's coping collapsed. The force felt too close because the line they had relied on had been violated. If it could be closer, it could be closer again. If it could choose proximity, then proximity was a tool it could use at will. As they moved, the men began to feel that they were being guided, not through attack, but through placement. They angled away from one ridge and found the presence appearing along the next. They tried to take lower ground and found the presence visible through thin trunks on the slope above. It never blocked them outright. It did not stand directly in their path. It did not force them to stop. It simply remained present enough, in the right places, to keep their attention fixed and their movement constrained. Eventually, according to the account, one of them said quietly that they were leaving. Not leaving the day's hunt, but leaving the woods, abandoning the remaining time, giving up the work that had brought them there. That statement was not argued with. No one protested lost money or lost meat. No one insisted on one more hour. That is significant. Hunters will tolerate discomfort and risk for profit. They will push through weather. They will push through fatigue. They will push through hunger. They do not abandon a multi-day hunt lightly. They abandoned it because they felt, in that moment of collapsed distance, that continuing was no longer work. It was exposure. They withdrew with discipline, but discipline under pressure becomes brittle. Every snapped twig sounded too loud. Every shadowed gap between trees felt like a place where the presence might appear again. And each time it did appear, not closer, not farther, simply present, the men's unease hardened into a kind of quiet certainty. They were being followed, not to be attacked, not to be spoken to be managed. When they finally reached the edge of the area where the forest opened slightly and the familiar signs returned, when birds began to move again and sound behaved normally, they did not celebrate. They did not joke. They did not talk about what they had seen in a relieved way. They simply continued moving as if the act of stopping might allow the presence to catch up in some other sense. As if you could not outrun it, but you could at least remove yourself from the conditions where it could position you. The account shifts abruptly after this, because retreat is less narratively satisfying than confrontation, and yet retreat is what professionals do. They withdrew and they returned to their communities, and in the seasons that followed, the effect of what happened is visible not in stories told loudly, but in what areas quietly fell out of use. That is the consequence the record gives us. Not a corpse, not a confession, not an explanation, a map that changes. In the years that followed 1903, certain hunting grounds were used less and less by the men who knew them best. There was no public announcement, no posted warning, no official closure. The woods remained the woods, available to anyone willing to walk in. But professional habits leave traces, and one of those traces is absence. A ridgeline that once drew parties each fall began to sit empty. A drainage that was known for deer sign was approached and then bypassed. Younger hunters noticed older men steering them elsewhere without explanation, choosing longer routes, choosing less productive ground. When asked why, the answers were vague. Bad luck there. Not much game anymore. Too wet. Too much deadfall. Those explanations may have been partially true. The woods always change. But the pattern of avoidance aligned too cleanly with the area described in the 1903 statement to be coincidence. A practical withdrawal had occurred, not because something had been proven, but because something had been experienced and judged unprofitable in a deeper sense. What is especially telling is how little the phenomenon was referenced directly afterward. Men did not gather in town to tell wild tales. The presence did not become a public spectacle. Instead, it became something referred to indirectly, if at all. A glance when someone mentioned a certain stretch of timber, a brief silence, a change of subject. In trades where reputation matters, a man does not want to be known as someone who panics at shadows. So the story, if it was shared cautiously, incomplete, focused on behavior rather than belief. The emphasis remained on what they did, not what they thought it was. The older advice persisted, but it did not expand into a mythology. If anything, it contracted. It became more procedural, more stripped down. Don't separate, don't linger, don't camp there. Those phrases were not accompanied by long explanations. They did not need to be. The men who repeated them did so with the tone of someone passing along safety information, not entertainment. It is possible that outsiders hunted those grounds in later years without incident. The record does not say. Professional avoidance does not mean a place is objectively dangerous for every person. It means that for those who experienced something there, the cost was not worth the risk. And when a set of men with deep knowledge of land quietly withdraws, that withdrawal itself becomes a kind of testimony. In small communities, avoidance becomes its own story. A place that no one uses begins to carry an atmosphere. Not because something supernatural radiates from it, but because human behavior has changed around it. Trails grow in, old camps rot, fewer boot prints appear. The woods reclaim the evidence of use. The 1903 hunters did not petition authorities. They did not ask for help. That is consistent with the time and with their trade. They treated the event as something to be managed privately. They removed the area from their working map. There is an important restraint here. The account does not claim that the presence took land or that it owned territory. The men did not speak of it like a predator guarding a range. They spoke of it like a condition that could recur, and the safest response was simply not to place yourself under its influence again. They did not seek to prove it. They did not seek to trap it. They did not seek to learn. They sought to avoid. That avoidance is what kept the account from growing into something more sensational. The story was not a victory. It was not a mystery to be solved. It was an experience that had altered professional practice. A change in behavior that persisted beyond the season. The statement survived, perhaps, because it fit into that practical framework. It was not written to terrify. It was written to explain why certain decisions had been made, and why future crews should consider making similar decisions. And that is the unsettling part. The account persisted without elaboration. It remained thin, incomplete, resistant to explanation. Not because the men lacked imagination, but because they treated imagination as irrelevant. They did not need to know what it was to know what it did. What it did was follow. What it did was pace. What it did was remain present enough to change routes, tighten spacing, enforce silence, and remove a portion of the forest from use. The record gives us no satisfying ending. It gives us a quiet absence on a map. And beneath that absence, if you read the final lines of recollection from years later, there is a suggestion that the presence did not end when the men left the woods. That the most lasting effect was not in the forest itself, but in how the men carried the sense of being followed into ordinary life, even when there was nothing to see. When people ask why the 1903 account remains disturbing, the simplest answer is that nothing happened in the way we expect horror to happen. No one was taken. No one was found. No violence was recorded. No voice spoke from the trees. And yet the men changed. They did not come home boasting. They did not come home laughing off nerves. They came home quieter. Not in the temporary way a hard trip can quiet a man, but in a way that suggests their internal assumptions had been altered. They had learned over days that a presence could control movement without touching them. That being observed could be enough to reshape behavior. That the point perhaps was not attack. In later recollections, the hunters did not describe nightmares of a face or claws or blood. They described habits. They described how they stopped walking alone at dusk even in familiar areas. How they began to position themselves in rooms so they could see doors. How they avoided long stretches of road at night where there was nothing to mark distance. These are not supernatural symptoms. They are behavioral evidence of sustained pressure. They are the imprint left by days spent adapting to a watcher that would not declare itself. One of them said, years later, that the worst part was the way the presence never had to commit. It never had to come close enough to be shot. It never had to threaten them in a way that could be confronted. It simply stayed with them until they obeyed the only command it seemed to issue, which was the command to leave. Another man said that he did not believe it followed them out of the woods in a literal sense. He did not claim it stood behind barns or watched through windows. But he admitted that after that season he could not stand the feeling of someone keeping pace behind him on a road, even if it was only another traveler. He said the sensation of being kept in view had lodged in him like a splinter. The record, in its restraint, offers one final idea, that some presences do not need to approach in order to control, that they do not need to touch you in order to move you, that they do not need to speak to make themselves understood. The 1903 hunters did not solve anything. They did not explain anything. They did not even describe the thing in a way that would satisfy curiosity. They did what professionals do when confronted with an unprofitable, uncontrollable condition. They withdrew, they adjusted, they avoided. And if you take their words seriously, the phenomenon did not need more than that. It did not need to leave proof. It did not need to take trophies. It did not need to show itself fully. Its effect was measured in altered routes, quiet camps, tightened spacing, and land removed from use. In that sense, the claim is less about a figure in the trees and more about what happens to human behavior when the forest stops feeling neutral. When it becomes a place where you are not simply alone or accompanied, but managed at a distance. The men called it being followed because that was the closest practical term they had. They did not claim to understand motive. They did not claim an ending. They only left a record that, for a few days in 1903, something remained present enough to dictate their movement without ever needing to come close. And the fact that it never approached is, in the end, the part that stays with you. Because it suggests that proximity was never the goal, only influence, only control. If that is true, then leaving is not a victory. It is compliance. And compliance, once learned, has a way of persisting long after the woods are out of sight.